Hi, everybody. I'm Jim. This is Great Books, Big Ideas, and we are continuing on our Year 1 Great Books reading plan with Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations. And this is an excerpt, really, of the first 9 chapters of Book 1, plus the introduction. So we'll do a quick rundown of what's happening in this reading, and then I have a few discussion topics to share with you. Coming up next on Great Books, Big Ideas. So yeah, I have never read Adam Smith before. This is brand new to me. I've heard of him. I've seen him quoted in my reading of Karl Marx in Das Kapital, but I've never actually read Adam Smith until now. And he can be a bit dry. It's very much an economic, political economy type of writing. He's 18th century, and but by the same token, he's talking about some really, really important stuff, and he's sort of like the architect of mercantile capitalism, or at least he's the guy who really first understood it in a systematic way. And let me give you a few biographical tidbits that I gleaned from my Great Books edition. He was born on June 5th, 1723, in Kirkcaldy, Scotland, 10 miles from Edinburgh. He seems to have been a mama's boy. His father died before he was born, and then his mother was very devoted to him, and he was very devoted to his mother. Here's a tidbit. In 1726, when I guess he was about 3 years old, he was kidnapped by gypsies. Wow. Apparently that was resolved pretty quickly, but wow, what a story that must have been. Anyway, at age 14, that's right, he attended the University of Glasgow, where he came under the influence of Francis Hutcheson, a professor of moral philosophy. And in 1740, Smith went to Balliol College, Oxford. He left in 1746 without completing his degree. He moved back home and continued his studies, and then he moved to Edinburgh. And in 1751, he became a professor at the University of Glasgow. And in this early career, he really was interested in moral philosophy, and he wrote a pretty famous book about that, which is it called Theory of Moral Sentiments? I'm not sure, but anyway, it's not in our great book set, but it may be in Penguin Classics. Anyway, he became a close friend while he was at Glasgow with David Hume. And he was also befriended by Glasgow's economic elite. He was a proponent of free trade. And in 1763, he gave up academia for a lifetime pension from Charles Townshend in return for tutoring Townshend's stepsons. They spent a lot of time on the continent. Smith became a minor celebrity in the French salons. He eventually moved back to Scotland and lived with his mother, where he worked on The Wealth of Nations. And by 1773, he was spending a lot of time in London, and he knew many of the public intellectuals there. He also conversed frequently with Benjamin Franklin in America. And in 1778, he became Commissioner of the Customs of Scotland, and he died in July 17th, 1790. So this huge, massive figure in the Scottish Enlightenment. They really produced a lot of great intellectuals back in that time period. So the Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, which is the full title, that was published in 1776, and it became something of a Bible about free market mercantile capitalism. It's a major work in the field of political economy. So let's jump into some brief chapter summaries. These, I don't even know if I would call these summaries. They're more like what Jim gleaned from this pretty dense stuff. I am not an economist. I don't pretend to be that. But, I do the best I can slogging through these works. So in chapter 1, the main theme is the division of labor. And this is an idea that Adam Smith is very well known for. It's the greatest improvement in the productive powers of labor are a result of the division of labor. File this one as a big idea. Generally, we can say that if we can divvy up work tasks into smaller tasks, performed by individual workers who are sort of specializing in that task, then we can produce much, much more than could be performed by one man alone. And let me quote the famous pins example, the manufacturer of pins, on page 3 of the text. And I think he has a lot of examples that kind of spice things up a little bit. So I thought this was worthy of quoting. To take an example, therefore, from a very trifling manufacturer, but one in which the division of labor has been very often taken notice of, the trade of the pin maker, a workman not educated to this business, which the division of labor has rendered a distinct trade, nor acquainted with the use of the machinery employed in it, could scarce perhaps with his utmost industry make 1 pin in a day, and certainly could not make 20. But in the way in which this business is now carried on, not only the whole work is a peculiar trade, but it is divided into a number of branches, of which the greater part are likewise peculiar trades. One man draws out the wire, another straights it, a third cuts it, a fourth points it, a fifth grinds it at the top for receiving the head. To make the head requires 2 or 3 distinct operations. To put it on is a peculiar business. To whiten the pins is another. It is even a trade by itself to put them into the paper. And the important business of making a pin is in this manner divided into about 18 distinct operations, which in some manufactories are all performed by distinct hands, though in others the same man will sometimes perform 2 or 3 of them. I have seen a small manufactory of this kind where 10 men only were employed, and where some of them consequently performed 2 or 3 distinct operations. But though they were very poor, and therefore but indifferently accommodated with the necessary machinery, they could, when they exerted themselves, make among them about 12 pounds of pins in a day. There are in a pound upwards of 4,000 pins of a middling size. Those 10 persons, therefore, could make among them upwards of 48,000 pins in a day. Each person, therefore, making a 10th part of 48,000 pins might be considered as making 4,800 pins in a day. But if they had all wrought separately and independently, and without any of them having been educated to this peculiar business, they certainly could not each of them have made 20, perhaps not 1 pin in a day. That is certainly not the 240th, perhaps not the 4,800th part of what they are at present capable of performing, in consequence of a proper division and combination of their different operations. So you get the idea. You divide the labor, you can produce more. The increase in quantity of work under the division of labor stems from 3 circumstances. Each worker's dexterity increases, time is saved, and machines get invented to facilitate and abridge the labor. So these forces kind of combine, and that all increases productivity. All right, chapter 2 of the principle which gives occasion to the division of labor. There is in human nature a propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another. We are a trading species, I suppose. And Smith says this disposition gives rise to the division of labor. There's a lot more to it, but that's just like a thumbnail. Chapter 3, that the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. So when the market is small, nobody has any encouragement to dedicate himself to one job, quote, for want of the power to exchange all that surplus part of the produce of his own labor, which is over and above his own consumption, end quote. So many industries are inconceivable in anywhere but large towns and cities, where you can kind of have the division of labor happening. In the more rural communities, you're going to find workers who are really more like jacks of all trades. And you will find the division of labor emerging in communities also with convenient access to the sea and navigable rivers too. So you can move these commodities around once they get produced. Chapter 4 is about money, about the origin and the use of money. Something we all need more of. So when division of labor becomes well established, man enters a commercial exchange economy, selling his surplus produce to others. And to facilitate that exchange, you need a medium of exchange, something practical, something durable, something easy to measure and value. And metal coinage was the answer. It is almost imperishable. It can be divided into parts. And Smith goes into an extended explanation of the use of metals for money, their conveniences and inconveniences, the denominations of coins, and the rules of exchange that make a merchant economy tick. So if you want to understand where money comes from, this is a valuable chapter. Chapter 5 is about the real and nominal price of commodities, or the price in labor and their price in money. Okay. In an economy based on the division of labor, people become interdependent on one another. You sort of become a specialist, like working on these smaller tasks as a worker, and everyone has their little special thing that they do, and then all this stuff gets produced in much more massive quantities, and people are buying and selling and so forth, and then they become mutually dependent on one another for that to tick. And you are rich or poor according to the degree in which you can afford to buy things, which is based on labor as the real measure of exchange value. This is known as the labor theory of value, another big idea that Smith is famous for. Wealth, he quotes, I think, Thomas Hobbes here, wealth is power. More particularly, he says, purchasing power. There are many variables with respect to labor that make its value harder to measure. It becomes easier to estimate exchange value by some other commodity than labor. And that commodity is money. So the real price is based on labor value. The nominal price is in the quantity of money. While monetary value fluctuates constantly, labor is the only standard that's stable that you can use to compare value across time and place. And that's by the same token, it's pretty difficult to sort of quantify that labor value sometimes. All right, moving on to chapter 6 of the component parts of the price of commodities. Here, Smith is tracing how the economy changed from a, quote, rude state of society, unquote, the pre-market economy, wherein all produce of labor belonged to the worker and the quantity of labor employed in producing a commodity. This changed with the accumulation of stock, another key word in Smith. Quote, in exchanging the complete manufacture, either for money, for labor, or for other goods, over and above what may be sufficient to pay the price of materials and the wages of the workmen, something must be given for the profits of the undertaker of the work, who hazards his stock in this adventure. Value resolves into two parts, one which pays wages, and the other the profits of the employer whose stock of materials and wages was advanced. And then in this chapter comes a passage that I think anticipates the theories of Karl Marx. Karl Marx in Capital talks about Adam Smith a lot. You know, the Capital is a critique of political economy. So Adam Smith is a major source in that book. He comes up a lot. But this, I think, this passage actually anticipates some of Marx's theories. And it's a short sentence. Quote, "The whole produce of labor does not always belong to the laborer. He must, in most cases, share it with the owner of the stock which employs him." This next passage also foreshadows Karl Marx, I think. Quote, "As soon as the land of any country has become private property, the landlords, like all other men, love to reap where they never sowed and demand a rent even for its natural produce, the wood of the forest, the grass of the field, and all the natural fruits of the earth, which when land was common, cost the laborer only the trouble of gathering them, come even to him to have an additional price fixed upon them. He must then pay for the license to gather them, and must give up to the landlord a portion of what his labor either collects or produces. And this is what we call rent. So there are, in this chapter, he talks about three component parts of price: the quantity of labor, rent, and profit. Moving on to chapter 7 of the natural and market price of commodities. There is an average rate of wages and profit in every different employment of labor and stock. It is naturally regulated, according to Smith, by general circumstances, their richness or poverty, the state of their condition, whether it be rising, falling, or stable, and the particular nature of the employment. And there is similarly an average rate of rent. Here's a quote: "When the price of any commodity is neither more nor less than what is sufficient to pay the rent of the land, the wages of the labor, and the profits of the stock employed in raising, preparing, and bringing it to market, according to their natural rates, the commodity is then sold for what may be called its natural price." Natural price. But then there's the actual price. The actual price is known as the market price, and this fluctuates according to the law of supply and demand, something that he explores at length in the chapter. Supply and demand, basic economics. All right, let's move on to chapter 8 of the wages of labor. And this is a deep dive into how the rate of wages is determined. And here I would like to highlight what seems to me to be an acknowledgement of class war, how the clash between the classes is baked into the capitalist system. This comes from page 32 of the text. What are the common wages of labor depends everywhere upon the contract usually made between those two parties, whose interests are by no means the same. A workman desire to get as much, the masters to give as little as possible. The former are disposed to combine in order to raise, the latter in order to lower the wages of labor. Labor wants more money, more wages. The masters, the owners, want to give as little as possible. It just boils down to that. Continuing on with our quote. It is not, however, difficult to foresee which of the two parties must, upon all ordinary occasions, have the advantage in the dispute. Who has the advantage? And force the other into a compliance with their terms. The masters, being fewer in number, can combine much more easily, and the law, besides, authorizes, or at least does not prohibit, their combinations, while it prohibits those of the workmen. It's a stacked deck. It's a rigged system. We have no acts of Parliament against combining to lower the price of work, but many, many acts of Parliament against combining to raise it. In all such disputes, the masters can hold out much longer. Okay? It's rigged in favor of the masters, the owners. So in other words, masters can collude to suppress wages, but there is a rate below which it's impossible to reduce wages. You can't have your workers starving, for example, or not being able to afford to raise a family. And a growing economy naturally drives up demand for labor, which tends to increase their wages. So the more prosperous the country is, usually the better off the workers are going to be. Chapter 9, the last in our sampling here, is about the profits of stock. Something that I'm not an expert in by any means, but I'll do the best I can. This analyzes the circumstances influencing the rise and fall in the profits of stock. Like the wages of labor, they fluctuate, and they're also harder to measure. And Smith digs into the market rate of interest as a proxy for profit. And he does a lot of comparative analysis of different countries and the colonies in the New World and their rates of interest and how they fluctuate and how those are indicators. And generally speaking, as a nation prospers and accumulates capital, growing competition will drive down the average rate of profit. I'm sure there's a lot more going on in that chapter, but that's the best I can do for you. Okay. Those are the 9 chapters that were part of the reading. Let's now dig into a few discussion topics. We're always thinking in these discussion topics about contemporary relevance, resonances, and that kind of thing. And that's the nature of some of these questions. So let's start with this one. Adam Smith paints a picture of a capitalist society motivated by self-interest. He talks a lot about this, I think, in chapter 2. Does such a society erode social cohesion? Or does the fact that the economy is mutually interdependent, something I highlighted earlier, does that actually bind people closer together? It's food for thought, something to kick around. Next, let's talk a bit about the labor theory of value. Is Smith's labor theory of value still a valid framework for understanding wealth today? My personal opinion is there's still a lot to the labor theory of value. When I encountered that in reading Karl Marx, I thought he was on to something too. And clearly he got a lot of this from Adam Smith. So I think there's still something to it, but maybe it's a little bit harder to see it. But I'm not an economist, so you're probably asking the wrong guy for an opinion here. Just asking the questions. Next, here's another topic. It seems beyond doubt that the division of labor results in massive productivity gains. Think of the pins example. But does this come at too high a cost in terms of human factors like creativity and personal fulfillment? So in other words, if your job all day is to just, like put the head on the pin and that you're doing that all day, yeah, sure, you guys can be very productive in your workhouse where you're cranking out, thousands of pins per day, but it doesn't sound exactly like the most creative and inspiring type of labor. Anyway, is it personally fulfilling? I don't know. I mean, if you can afford to feed your family, I guess that's fulfilling. But there does seem to be some, there's a cost benefit analysis that needs to happen here when we think about the division of labor, and maybe like, can it go too far? Like, I wonder. Let's talk also about natural price. Smith speaks of natural price, where free competition establishes a balance for the market pricing. Now, in our world, in a world of international commerce and monopolies and government bailouts and artificial scarcity, has this model of the natural price been disrupted? What becomes of the natural price when price is so manipulated artificially? Here's one last discussion topic to think about. Smith is remarkably candid. You might be surprised how candid he is. I was. He's remarkably candid about how the free market deck is stacked in favor of the masters, the owners of capital. Is that the case? Like, is the free market deck stacked in favor of the masters? How does his 18th century view align with contemporary debates about labor unions, about right to work laws, and wage stagnation? I have an opinion on that. I think he was right about this point, that the system and the markets are stacked, rigged to an extent. I know that's a loaded word, but it's just structurally they're at an advantage. And they've got the law, the legal apparatus on their side, and usually the government's on their side, and all the rest. Feel free to comment on any of those discussion topics, or feed a few more discussion topics down below. Questions, comments, thoughts, reactions. If you've read more of Adam Smith than I have, what else is in store? But this was a nice dose of economic theory, political economy, and I'm glad I finally got around to reading some of him. Of course, I'll try to get back and read the rest of this book in due course in my journey through the great book set. Next up on our first year program playlist is de Tocqueville. And here we have to go to the 1990 edition, because Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America, is not in the first edition of the Great Books of the Western World. So here we have a departure, and the reading here, we're just reading a bit of it, is Volume 1, Part 2, Chapters 6 through 8. That's next up on this playlist for Great Books, Big Ideas, our Year 1 Great Books reading plan. Trying to get through Year 1. I'm like way past the Year 1 mark in time chronology, but I feel like I've got a good amount of momentum here to finish this out this summer. I'm hoping maybe in the next month and a half, we'll get through the final readings. We've only got 1, 2, 3. We only have four more readings in this plan for Year 1. Hope you enjoyed this little dive into the world of Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations. And thanks so much for watching. And I hope you'll come back and revisit the channel soon. Bye-bye.